Hello and welcome back. I am Candace, the storybook lady, and we're here for another reading of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so this is our third session tonight. And so let's recap just a little bit. We have 4 kids, right? 2 of which have been to a new world that they found through the wardrobe. One has been truthful about it and one is not, right? Can you tell me the reasons? Why was Edmund not truthful about what he found when he went through the wardrobe? Why didn't he tell his brothers and his sisters that Lucy was right? Does anybody remember? That's right. His desire for Turkish delight has overridden his commitment to the truth. So the White Witch promised him that if he could bring everybody back to her, she would give him as much Turkish delight as he could want. And so he just decided to, kind of lie for the moment and figure out what he's going to do to try to get everybody back to Narnia. So we left there, and then if you recall, Peter and Susan, they're the oldest 2, right? Yeah, they talked to who last week? Because they were kind of struggling with how to handle the situation, right? That's right, they talked to the professor. And they were thinking the professor would tell them, yeah, Lucy's making this up. How do we get her help? But did the professor say that? Nope. He surprised them, didn't he? He was saying, oh, well, if she's usually truthful, you should treat her as if she's telling the truth. And so that's kind of what they did, and we kind of left it and the book seems to suggest that maybe the adventures might end, but then the author promised us that the adventures would not end. So now we have to figure out, how is this going to happen? How is this going to go forward? Do you think Edmund will just tell the truth all of a sudden? Do you think Peter and Susan are going to find their way to Narnia themselves? I don't know. Let's find out, right? This house of the professors, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see over it. It was a sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in histories, and well it might be, for all manner of stories we were told about it, that some of them even stranger than the one I'm telling you now. And when parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission. And Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them round, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter almost in the first morning, along with a good many other instructions, "And please remember you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party over the house." Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing round with a crowd of strange grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other 3 thought the same. That was how the adventures began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it to bits when the 2 girls rushed in the room and said, "Oh, look out! Here comes the Macready and the whole gang with her." "Sharp's the word," said Peter, and all 4 made off through the door at the far end of the room. And when they had got out into the green room and beyond it, into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them, and realized that Mrs. Macready must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back stairs instead of the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they had lost their heads, or that Mrs. Macready was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia, they seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere, until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother those strippers. Here, let's get into the wardrobe room until they've passed. No one will follow us in there." But the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage, and then someone fumbling at the door, and then they saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's nowhere else," and they flung open the wardrobe, all 4 of them bundled inside it, and sat there, panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed, but did not shut it, For, of course, he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never, never shut yourself up in a wardrobe. Chapter 6. Into the Forest. I wish the McCready would hurry up and take all those people away, said Susan presently. I'm getting horribly cramped. What a filthy smell of camphor, said Edmund. I expect the pockets of these coats are full of it, said Susan, to keep away the moths. There's something sticking into my back, said Peter. And isn't it cold, said Susan. Now that you mention it, it is cold, said Peter. And hang it all, it's wet, too. What's the matter with this place? I'm sitting on something wet. It's getting wetter every minute. He struggled to his feet. Let's get out, said Edmund. They've gone. Oh, said Susan suddenly, and everyone asked her what was the matter. I'm sitting against a tree, said Susan, and look, it's getting light over there. By Jove, you're right, said Peter. And look there, and there. It's trees all around, and this wet stuff is snow. Why, I do believe we got into Lucy's wood after all. And now there was no mistaking it, and all four children stood blinking in the daylight of a winter day. Behind them were coats hanging on pegs. In front of them were snow-covered trees. Peter turned at once to Lucy. I apologize for not believing you, he said. I'm sorry. Will you shake hands? Of course, said Lucy, and did. And now, said Susan, what do we do next? Do? Said Peter. Why, go and explore the wood, of course. Ugh, said Susan, stamping her feet. It's pretty cold. What about putting on some of those coats? They're not ours, said Peter doubtfully. I'm sure nobody would mind, said Susan. It isn't as if we wanted to take them out of the house. We shan't take them even out of the wardrobe. I never thought of that, Sue, said Peter. Of course, now that you put it that way, I see. No one could say you had bagged a coat as long as you leave it in the wardrobe where you found it. And I suppose this whole country is in the wardrobe. They immediately carried out Susan's very sensible plan. The coats were rather too big for them, so that they came down to their heels and looked more like royal robes than coats when they had put them on. But they all felt a good deal warmer, and each thought of the others looked better in their new get-ups and more suitable to the landscape. We can pretend we're Arctic explorers, said Lucy. This is going to be exciting, although enough without pretending, said Peter, as he began leading the way forward into the forest. There were heavy, darkish clouds overhead, and it looked as if there might be more snow than before night. I say, said Edmund presently, aren't we be bearing a bit more to the left? That is, if we are aiming for the lamppost? He had forgotten for the moment that he must pretend never to have been in the world before. The moment the words were out of his mouth, he realized that he'd given himself away. Everyone stopped. Everyone stared at him. Peter whistled. So you really were here, he said. That time Lou said she'd met you in here? And you made out she was telling lies? There was dead silence. Well, of all the poisonous little beasts, said Peter, and shrugged his shoulders and said no more. There seemed, indeed, no more to say. And presently the four resumed their journey, but Edmund was saying to himself, I'll pay you all out for this, you pack of stuck-up, self-satisfied prigs. Where are we going anyway? said Susan, chiefly for the sake of changing the subject. I think Lou ought to be the leader, said Peter. Goodness knows she deserves it. Where will you take us, Lou? What about going to see Mr. Tumnus? Said Lucy. He's the nice fawn I told you about. Everyone agreed to this, and off they went, walking briskly and stamping their feet. Lucy proved a good leader. At first she wondered whether she would be able to find the way, but she recognized an odd-looking tree on one place and a stump in another, and brought them on to where the ground became uneven and into the little valley, and at last to the very door of Mr. Tumnus's cave. But there a terrible surprise awaited them. The door had been wrenched off its hinges and broken to bits. Inside, the cave was dark and cold and had the damp feel and smell of a place that had not been lived in for several days. Snow had drifted in from the doorway and was heaped on the floor, mixed with something black, which turned out to be the charred sticks and ashes from the fire. Someone had apparently flung it about the room and then stamped it out. The crockery lay smashed on the floor, and the picture of the fawn's father had been slashed into shreds with a knife. "This is a pretty good washout," said Edmund. "Not much good coming here." "What is this?" said Peter, stooping down. He had just noticed a piece of paper which had been nailed through the carpet to the floor. "Is there anything written on it?" asked Susan. "Yes, I think there is," answered Peter, "but I can't read it in this light. Let's go out into the open air." They all went out in the daylight and crowded round Peter as he read the following words. "The former occupant of these premises, the Fawn Tumnus, is under arrest and awaiting his trial on a charge of high treason against Her Imperial Majesty Jadis, Queen of Narnia, Chatelaine of Cair Paravel, Empress of the Lone Islands, etc. Also of comforting her said Majesty's enemies, harboring spies, and fraternizing with humans. Signed, Margram, Captain of the Secret Police. Long live the Queen." The children stared at each other. I don't know that I'm going to like this place after all," said Susan. "Who's the Queen, Lou?" said Peter. "Do you know anything about her?" "She isn't a real queen at all," answered Lucy. "She's a horrible witch, the White Witch. Everyone, all the wood people, hate her. She has made an enchantment over this whole country so that it is always winter here and never Christmas." I wonder if there's any point in going on," said Susan. "I mean, it doesn't seem particularly safe here, and it looks as if it won't be much fun either. And it's getting colder every minute, and we've brought nothing to eat. What about just going home?" "Oh, but we can't, said Lucy suddenly. "Don't you see? We can't just go home. Not after this. It's all on my account that the poor fawn has gotten into this trouble. He hid me from the White Witch and showed me the way back. That's what it means by comforting the Queen's enemies and fraternizing with humans. We must simply try to rescue him." "A lot we could do," said Edmund, "when we haven't even got anything to eat." "Shut up, you," said Peter, who was still very angry with Edmund. "What do you think, Susan?" "I have a horrid feeling that Lou is right," said Susan. "I don't want to go a step further, and I wish we'd never come, but I think we must try to do something for Mr. whatever his name is. I mean the fawn." "That's what I feel too," said Peter. "I'm worried about having no food with us. I'd vote for going back and getting something from the larder, only there doesn't seem to be any certainty of getting into this country again when once you've gotten out of it. I think we'll have to go on." "So do I," said both the girls. "If only we knew where the poor chap was in prison," said Peter. They were still wondering what to do next when Lucy said, "Look, there's a robin with such a red breast. It's the first bird I've seen here. I say, I wonder, can birds talk in Narnia? It almost looks as if it wanted to say something to us." Then she turned to the robin and said, "Please, can you tell us where Tumnus the fawn has been taken to?" As she said this, she took a step toward the bird. It at once flew away, but only as far as to the next tree. There it perched and looked at them very hard, as if it understood all they had been saying. Almost without noticing that they had done so, the four children went a step or two nearer to it. At this, the robin flew away again to the next tree, and once more looked at them very hard. You couldn't have found a robin with a redder chest or a brighter eye. "Do you know," said Lucy, "I really believe he means us to follow him." "I've an idea he does," said Susan. "What do you think, Peter?" "Well, you might as well try it," answered Peter. The robin appeared to understand the matter thoroughly. It kept going from tree to tree, always a few yards ahead of them, but always so near that they could easily follow it. In this way it led them on, slightly downhill. Wherever the robin alighted, a little shower of snow would fall off the branch. Presently the clouds parted overhead and the winter sun came out, and the snow all around them grew dazzling bright. They had been traveling in this way for about half an hour, with the two girls in front, when Edmund said to Peter, "If you're not still too high and mighty to talk to me, I've something to say which you'd better listen to." "What is it?" asked Peter. "Hush, not so loud," said Edmund. "There's no good frightening the girls." "But have you realized what we're doing?" "What?" said Peter, lowering his voice to a whisper. "We're following a guide we know nothing about. How do we know which side that bird is on? Why shouldn't it be leading us into a trap?" "That's a nasty idea. Still, a robin, you know. They're good birds in all the stories I've ever read. I'm sure a robin wouldn't be on the wrong side." "If it comes to that, which is the right side? How do we know that the fawns are in the right and the queen, yes, I know we've been told she's a witch, is in the wrong? We don't really know anything about either." "The fawn saved Lucy." "He said he did. But how do we know? And there's another thing, too. Has anyone the least idea of the way home from here?" "Great Scott," said Peter. "I hadn't thought of that. And no chance of dinner either," said Edmund. Chapter 7. A Day with the Beavers. While the boys were whispering behind, both girls suddenly cried, "Oh!" and stopped. "The robin!" cried Lucy. "The robin! It's flown away!" And so it had, right out of sight. "And now what are we to do?" said Edmund, giving Peter a look which was as much to say, "What did I tell you?" "Shh! Look!" said Susan. "What?" said Peter. "There's something moving among the trees over there, to the left." They all stared as hard as they could, and no one felt very comfortable. "There it goes again," said Lucy presently. "I saw it too that time," said Peter. "It's still there. It's just gone behind that big tree." "What is it?" asked Lucy, trying very hard not to sound nervous. "Whatever it is," said Peter, "it's dodging us. It's something that doesn't want to be seen." "Let's go home," said Susan, and then, though nobody said it out loud, everyone suddenly realized the same fact that Edmund had whispered to Peter at the end of the last chapter. They were lost. "What's it like?" said Lucy. It's a kind of animal," said Susan, and then, Look, quick, there it is." They all saw it this time, a whisked, furry face, which had looked out at them from behind a tree. But this time it didn't immediately draw back. Instead, the animal put its paw against its mouth, just as the humans put their fingers on their lips when they're signaling you to be quiet. Then it disappeared again. The children all stood holding their breath. A moment later, the stranger came out from behind the tree, glanced all around as if it were afraid someone was watching, and said, "Hush," and made signs for them to join them in the thicker bit of the wood where it was standing, and then once more disappeared. "I know what it is," said Peter. "It's a beaver. I saw the tail." "It wants us to go to it," said Peter, "and it is warning us not to make a noise." "I know," said Peter. "The question is, are we going to do it or not?" "What do you think, Lou?" "I think it's a nice beaver," said Lucy. "Yes, but how do we know?" said Edmund. "Shan't we have to risk it?" said Susan. "I mean, it's no good just standing here, and I feel I want some dinner." At this moment, the beaver again popped its head out from behind the tree and beckoned earnestly to them. "Come on," said Peter. "Let's give it a try. I'll keep close together. We ought to be a match for one beaver if it turns out to be an enemy." So the children all got close together and walked up to the tree and walked up to the tree and in behind it, and there, sure enough, they found the beaver. But it still drew back, saying to them in a hoarse, throaty whisper, "Further in! Come further in! Right in here! We're not safe in the open!" Only when it had led them into a dark spot where 4 trees grew so close together that their boughs met, and the brown earth and pine needles could be seen underfoot, because no snow had been able to fall there, did it begin to talk to them. "Are you the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve?" it said to them. "We're some of them," said Peter. "Shh," said the beaver. "Not so loud, please. We're not safe, even here." "Why, who are you afraid of?" "There's no one here but ourselves." "There are the trees," said the beavers. "They're always listening. Most of them on our side, but there are trees that would betray us to her. You know who I mean." And it nodded its head several times. If it comes to talking about sides," said Edmund, "how do we know you're a friend?" "Not meaning to be rude, Mr. Beaver," added Peter, "but you see, we're strangers." Quite right," said the beaver. "Here's my token." With these words, it held up to them a little white object. They all looked in surprise, till suddenly Lucy said, "Oh my goodness, it's my handkerchief, the one I gave to poor Mr. Tumnus." "That's right," said the beaver. "Poor fellow, he got wind of the rest before it actually happened, and handed this over to me. He said if anything happened to him, I must meet you here, and take you on to—" Here the beaver's voice sank into silence, and it gave 1 or 2 very mysterious nods. Then, signaling to the children to stand as close around as they possibly could, so that their faces were actually tickled by its whispers, it added in a low whisper, "They say Aslan is on the move. Perhaps has already landed." And now a very curious thing happened. None of the children knew who Aslan was any more than you do. But the moment the beaver had spoken these words, everyone felt quite different. Perhaps it has sometimes happened to you in a dream that someone says something which you don't understand, but in the dream, it feels as if it has had some enormous meaning, either a terrifying one, which turns the whole dream into a nightmare, or else a lovely meaning, too lovely to put into words, which makes the dream so beautiful that you remember it all your life and are always wishing you could get into that dream again. It was like that now. At the name of Aslan, each one of the children felt something jump in its inside. Edmund felt a sensation of mysterious horror. Peter suddenly felt brave and adventurous. Susan felt as if some delicious smell or some delightful strain of music had just floated by her. And Lucy got the feeling you have when you wake up in the morning and realize it's the beginning of the holidays or the beginning of summer. "And what about Mr. Tumnus?" said Lucy. "Where is he?" "Shh," said the beaver. "Not here. I must bring you where you can talk, where you can have a real talk, and also dinner." No one except Edmund felt any difficulty about trusting Beaver now, and everyone, including Edmund, was very glad to hear the word dinner. They therefore all hurried along behind their new friend, who led them at a surprisingly quick pace, and always in the thickest parts of the forest for over an hour. Everyone was feeling very tired and very hungry when suddenly the trees began to get thinner in front of them, and the ground to fall steeply downhill. A minute later they came out under the open sky. The sun was still shining, and found themselves looking down on a fine sight. They were standing on the edge of a steep, narrow valley, at the bottom of which ran, at least it would have been running if it hadn't been frozen, a fairly large river. Just below them, a dam had been built across this river, and when they saw it, everyone suddenly remembered that, of course, beavers are always making dams, and felt quite sure that Mr. Beaver had made this one. They also noticed that he now had a sort of modest expression on his face, the sort of look people have when you're visiting a garden they've made or reading a story they've written. So it was only common politeness when Susan said, "What a lovely dam!" And Mr. Beaver didn't say, "Hush," this time, but merely a trifle. And it isn't really finished. Above the dam there was what ought to have been a deep pool, but was now, of course, a level floor of dark green ice. And below the dam, much lower down, was more ice. But instead of being smooth, this was all frozen into the foamy and wavy shapes in which the water had been rushing along at the very moment when the frost came. And where the water had been trickling over and spurting through the dam, there was now a glittering wall of icicles, as if the side of the dam had been covered all with flowers and wreaths and festoons of the purest sugar. And out in the middle, and partly on top of the dam, was a funny little house shaped rather like an enormous beehive, and from a hole in the roof smoke was going up, so that when you saw it, especially if you were hungry, you at once thought of cooking and became hungry than you were before. You all at once thought of cooking and became hungrier than you were before. That was what the others chiefly noticed, but Edmund noticed something else. A little lower down the river there was another small river, which came down another small valley to join it. And looking up that valley, Edmund could see two small hills, and he was almost sure they were the two hills which the White Witch had pointed out to him when he parted from her at the lamp-post that other day. And then between them, he thought, must be her palace, only a mile off or less. And he thought about Turkish delight and about being a king. And I wonder how Peter will like that, he asked himself, and horrible ideas came to his head. "Here we are," said Mr. Beaver, "and it looks as if Mrs. Beaver is expecting us. I'll lead the way, but be careful and don't slip." The top of the dam was wide enough to walk on, though not, for humans, a very nice place to walk because it was covered with ice. And though the frozen pool was level with it on one side, there was a nasty drop to the lower river on the other. Along this route, Mr. Beaver led them in a single file, right out of the middle, where they could take a long way up the river and a long way down it. And when they reached the middle, they were at the door of the other house. "Here we are, Mrs. Beaver," said Mr. Beaver. "I found them. Here's the sons and daughters of Adam and Eve." And they all went in. The first thing Lucy noticed as she went in was a burring sound, and the first thing she saw was a kind-looking old she-beaver, sitting in the corner with a thread in her mouth, working busily at her sewing machine. And it was from it that the sound came. She stopped her work and got up as soon as the children came in. "So you've come at last," she said, holding out both her wrinkled old paws. "At last! To think that I ever should live to see this day. The potatoes are on boiling and the kettle's singing, and I dare say, Mr. Beaver, you'll get us some fish?" "That I will," said Mr. Beaver, and he went out of the house. Peter went with him, and across the ice of the deep pool to where he had a little hole in the ice, which he kept open every day with his hatchet. They took a pail with them. Mr. Beaver sat down quietly at the edge of the hole. He didn't seem to mind it being so chilly. Looked hard at it and suddenly shot in his paw. And before you could say Jack Robinson had whisked out a beautiful trout. They did it again, all over again, until they had a fine catch of fish. Meanwhile, the girls were helping Mrs. Beaver to fill the kettle and lay the table and cut the bread and put the plates in the oven to heat and draw a huge jug of beer for Mr. Beaver from a barrel which stood in one corner of the house, and to put the frying pan and to get the dripping hot. Lucy thought the Beavers had a very snug little home, though it was not at all like Mr. Tumnus's cave. There were no books or pictures, and instead of beds, there were bunks, like on a board ship, built into the wall, and there were hams and strings of onions hanging off from the roof, and against the walls there were gumboots and oilskins and hatchets and pairs of shears and spades and towels and things for carrying motor and fish rods and fishing nets and sacks, and the cloth on the table, though very clean, was very rough. Just as the frying pan was nicely hissing, Peter and Mr. Beaver came in with the fish, and Mr. Beaver had already opened with his wife and cleaned out in the open air. You can now think how good the new caught fish smelled while they were frying, and how hungry the children longed for them to be done, and how very much hungry still they had to become before Mr. Beaver said, "Now we're nearly ready." Susan drained the potatoes and put them all back in the empty pot to dry on the side of the range, while Lucy was helping Mrs. Beaver to dish up the trout, so that in a very few minutes everyone was drawing up their stools, for it was a three-legged stools in the Beaver's house, except for Mrs. Beaver's own special rocking chair beside the fire, and preparing to enjoy themselves. There was a jug of creamy milk for the children. Mr. Beaver stuck to beer, and a great big lump of deep yellow butter in the middle of the table, from which everyone took as much as he wanted to go with his potatoes. And all the children thought, and I agree with them, that there's nothing to beat good freshwater fish if you eat it when it has been alive half an hour ago and has come out of a pan half a minute ago. And when they had finished the fish, Mrs. Beaver brought unexpectedly out of the oven a great and glorious sticky marmalade roll, steaming hot, and at the same time moved the kettle onto the fire, so that when they had finished the marmalade roll, the tea was made and ready to be poured out. And when each person had got his or her cup of tea, each person shoved back his or her stool, so as to be able to lean against the wall, and gave a long sigh of contentment. "And now," Mr. Beaver said, pushing away his empty beer mug and pulling his cup of tea towards him, "if you'll just wait till I've got my pipe lit up and going nicely. Why, now can we get to the business? It's snowing again," he added, cocking his eye at the window. "That's all the better, because it means we shan't have any visitors, and if anyone should have been trying to follow you, why, he won't find any tracks." That's them eating in the Beaver's home. So we'll stop there. So all of a sudden, all four of them find themselves in Narnia. And they are once again introduced with this idea of the White Witch being bad, with it always snowing and never Christmas. And that there's, some people in the forest are for her, some people are against her. And we still have Edmund keeping the secret that he's met her, that she's offered him Turkish Delight, and that he wants to go back to her home for more Turkish Delight. So that's a really big secret, don't you think? So I wonder, how will everyone else find out about Edmund's secret? Or will he tell them? Or I wonder how that will work out. And will they find out before the White Witch finds them, right? Because it seems like she's in search of them. So these are all things for next time. Thank you for joining us at Liberty Readers. I'm Candace, Storybook Lady, and we look forward to you joining us next week.